Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I was encouraged by the Honourable Member for Labrie. He said that I should not be intimidated by the podium, that it works well for short men. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, my support for this bill finds its inspiration from an increased rate of gross domestic product by 2.5%, a reducing unemployment rate at just over 20%, a primary surplus, Mr. Speaker, of over 45 million, and the current surplus upwards of 62 million. Mr. Speaker, these improved economic indicators signal the beginning of a revival of the overall economy. Building a resilient economy, Mr. Speaker, is the foundation of our aspiration to create more jobs, improve the education sector, and deliver a quality healthcare system. While we have yet not arrived, Mr. Speaker, we are currently well on our way to doing so. Mr. Speaker, when the United Workers' Party assumed the government, unemployment was high. The economic growth of the country, Madam Speaker, was very slow, averaging 1.3% over the last decade. And the debt was extremely high, Mr. Speaker, a situation which applied shackles on the economic fortunes of the people of St. Lucia. Madam Speaker, as a result, what they did, Mr. Speaker, was place their hopes in the confidence of the government of the United Workers' Party. Mr. Speaker, I have reasons to be optimistic about the future, as all indications suggest that unemployment is down, economic growth is on the uptick, and there's a new strategy to manage the persistent stronghold of
Honorable Member,
high debt levels.
Do you need protection from both sides?
No, that's okay, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that's okay, that's okay. You know, Mr. Speaker, they say that defense, they say that attack is the best form of defense. And so their attacks is their defense because they know I'm coming. So, Mr. Speaker, they know very well I'm coming. So, Mr. Speaker, I would also like to give my fullest endorsement. See, I'm trying to behave myself tonight. Of the theme adopted by this government, Mr. Speaker, building resilience today to secure our future. This is instructive of the kind of forward and proactive thinking that characterizes this administration, committed to working for not just some of the people, as being suggested tonight, but, Mr. Speaker, but for all of the people of St. Lucia. And, Mr. Speaker, remember very well in the debate on the estimates, my colleague, member for Grosley, did tell us in very eloquent fashion how when he came in as Minister of Sport, he didn't victimize the Honourable Member for Canaries South. He actually kept him on as CEO for the World Cup. And when I heard him talking, Mr. Speaker, about it, I recalled very well that it was because of the generosity and the caring and the compassion of a United Workers' Party philosophy that kept you. So, Mr. Speaker, we're not in the business of victimizing. We work for all of the people, not just for friends and family. Mr. Speaker, please allow me to adopt the 4 main focus areas identified to build the much-needed resilience for a bright and prosperous future, stemming from human reliance, a resilient public service, resilient physical infrastructure, debt sustainability, all important for the comprehensive and sustained development of a strong and robust St. Lucia. Mr. Speaker, tourism led the revival. Mr. Speaker, tourism, which I am charged with responsibility, is expected to contribute heavily to building a strong and resilient nation that today's global geopolitics demand of small island developing states. Mr. Speaker, therefore, please allow me to update this honorable House on the outstanding year which the tourism sector recorded in 2017. Not only was St. Lucia the Caribbean Tourism Organization's fastest growing tourist destination in 2017, the island also registered a record-breaking year. Mr. Speaker, for it was in 2017 that total stereo of arrivals were at 386,127, and this is the first time, honorable member, that St. Lucia had recorded such a high number of stayover visitors. Mr. Speaker, this represented an 11% growth in airline passengers. This is the first time in our history that we've recorded this amount by air. Mr. Speaker, the year 2017 also recorded a strong rebound in the cruise tourism at 669,217 cruise passengers, or a 13% increase in cruise passengers visiting our country. Mr. Speaker, this is in response to a decline by 13%, which we have inherited by the previous administration the year prior. Mr. Speaker, the honorable member for Canaries South, who is claim to fame in tourism, is receiving briefs from individuals who, from time to time, Mr. Speaker, may mislead him on where the industry is going. Mr. Speaker, I know for a fact, and Mr. Speaker, that he is no expert in the industry. Because if he was an expert and he had a clue as to what was going on, he would have known, Mr. Speaker, that Royalton never opened 500 rooms. That when we came in, Mr. Speaker, that they had 350 rooms. And Mr. Speaker, in the third quarter of 2017, they opened an additional 19 to bring the total number of rooms to 456. And so, honorable member, what I would advise is that you come, have a meeting, and try to understand what's really happening in tourism. Because as I listen to you, I hear a number of misinformation, and I do understand, because you did the same thing at West Indies Cricket. You tend to speak about things that you absolutely do not understand.
Honorable member.
And so, Mr. Speaker.
You speak through the chair.
And so, Mr. Speaker. And so, Mr. Speaker, I am on record. I am on record, Mr. Speaker, of saying, and Mr. Speaker, I want to choose my words very carefully because I have a lot to say. I am on record of saying, Mr. Speaker, that while the honorable gentleman worked at West Indies Cricket, that he received 14 lawsuits as CEO and lost all of them. His score, therefore, is 14-0. In fact, they're about to fire him, Mr. Speaker, when they realized that he was going to bankrupt the organization in lawsuits. Mr. Speaker, not only did he misspeak, he's on record as well as also saying that a judgment by a magistrate from Trinidad was unfair and, Mr. Speaker, wasn't in keeping with the law. Mr. Speaker, the president at the time, who he described as a calming influence, the president of the then West Indies Cricket Board, I'm not allowed to name names, did actually write a letter apologizing to the judge after the honorable member for Canaries South had misbehaved rather poorly. So, Mr. Speaker, that
honorable member.
Yes. This kind of
honorable member. Member.
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
I always try to get members. You have some latitude, but always remember. Now, let me be specific. I'm referring here now to 65-2. So always try to keep your presentation, according to 65-2, within the financial and economic state of the island and the general principles of government policy. So whatever you say, you need to tie it to what you say.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was just drawing the principle.
I have no issue. Don't go that far that you cannot tie it to the
So, Mr. Speaker, we see a principle here of a member who are speaking on matters for which he doesn't have an acute understanding. So, Mr. Speaker, the cruise industry continues to play an essential role in the development of our economy in 2018, when Port Castries, for the first time, hosted a quantum-class vessel, Anthem of the Seas, with a capacity of 5,000 passengers. Mr. Speaker, this historic call to Port Castries by Royal Caribbean Cruise Lines was made possible by the 63 million expansion of berth number 1 at Point Seraphin. It has positioned the island for even greater levels, Mr. Speaker, of cruise arrivals this year, when we are projected to welcome 800,000 visitors via cruise ships. Mr. Speaker, the overwhelming praise heaped on the sector's performance by taxi drivers, vendors, and the general public were loud enough to silence the shallow attempts of the naysayers and the opposition to undermine what has been a buoyant cruise season. Mr. Speaker, there were days that Port Castries was overwhelmed by the sheer number of vessels which came to the port. Mr. Speaker, we were forced to tender at times in the open seas as the berthing facilities became inadequate. Mr. Speaker, the position that the successful cruise industry, which is clear to even the opposition leader, who is somehow suggesting that due to the hurricane season, we have succeeded. But Mr. Speaker, I want to say to him that St. Lucia hasn't succeeded. We've actually lost, because Carnival Cruise Lines, which brings the Fascination vessel every single Thursday, it has a capacity of about 2,500 passengers, and coming 4 times a week at 100% occupancy would mean that on a monthly basis we would lose 10,000 beds from one cruise line. Mr. Speaker, FEMA was using the ship, and that's the Federal Emergency Management Agency of the United States. And what they were doing, Mr. Speaker, was using the vessel to carry hurricane aid supplies to some of their jurisdictions in the Caribbean that were affected. So if you think of the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, 2 of the jurisdictions most affected by the hurricane season, we see therefore that they hauled the ship out of operation, and St. Lucia actually lost the capacity of about 30,000 visitors. We still grew as a result, Mr. Speaker, despite this position. So this had absolutely nothing, this had absolutely nothing, Honorable Mr. Speaker, to do with the hurricane season. The other thing I want to point out is that I was part of an OECS delegation that went to the cruise lines shortly after the hurricane season with a view to discuss the whole situation. And Mr. Speaker, we were looking at the potential of perhaps a new home port in light of Puerto Rico's misfortune. We were told then, Mr. Speaker, that the cruise lines had so much confidence in the rebuilding effort that it was only in a matter of weeks that they were going to reinstate Puerto Rico as a home port. Hence, there was no chance for the relocation. So I just want to bring this House up to date on those matters. And I want to debunk the ridiculous suggestion by my friend from Castries Southeast, who believes that Castries East, Castries Southeast is a lot more brilliant than that. But my friend from Castries East, who believes that $5 can block a hole, that this had absolutely nothing to do with the hurricane season, but it had everything to do, Mr. Speaker, with a government that is committed, a government that was clear about what it wanted to do. Mr. Speaker, when I came in as minister, and I met the old regime of the St. Lucia Tourist Board, where Mr. Hilaire, the honorable member for Castries South, would get his briefs. Mr. Speaker, it was clear then that there was no clear strategy as it relates to what we were going to do about the cruise industry. And the industry had declined, if you remember, and the social economic review is clear, the cruise sector, by about 20% at that time. It was midway a year through. And I asked the question, between SLASPA and the tourist board, who is responsible for marketing the destination for cruise tourism? Having recognized, Mr. Speaker, that the focus was clearly on hotel guests and the land-based tourism, I was told that there is an ambiguity between the tourist board and SLASPA. So I said to the leadership of the board then, that from today, we are making a decision that tourism will lead the charge and market this destination to cruise passengers. Mr. Speaker, the result is very, very clear. In the social economic review, we will see in table 5, we see that in the quarterly performances, table 6 rather, in the quarterly performance, you would see that cruise passengers did had a tremendous spike in the second quarter, contrary to the momentum that the member for Canaries South is suggesting that we inherited. We didn't inherit anything about a directionless position. We didn't inherit anything different from a jazz festival that was hemorrhaging the tourist board. We didn't inherit anything but debt. The board was $10 million in debt. No tour operator wanted to work with St. Lucia because St. Lucia was bad news. We were in the red. And you know, Mr. Speaker, it is painful to be in the red. You know, my friends over there. Painful to be in the red. And so, Mr. Speaker, having suffered so much pain, we have now brought the board to zero debt, and we are now in the black. But you see, Mr. Speaker, when people stand up and speak, and they engage in these propaganda machinery for cheap politics, and you try to undermine the number one sector, tourism, that so many people depend on their jobs, that so many taxi drivers rely on for businesses, and you raise up and you quote numbers that are not true. It's the old trick in politics. I have the numbers. Here it is. Here it is. I mean, that is not what the figures say. The figures are actually very clear, Mr. Speaker. In table 5, table 6 rather, it shows a quarterly performance of the industry. And we see here, Mr. Speaker, interestingly, in the year 2016, it's there, social economic review, the same numbers you quoted. In the first quarter, Mr. Speaker, it showed that in 2015, there were total number of visitors, 415,288. That's 2015. You said we were growing. But in 2016, the first quarter, Mr. Speaker, slumped from 415 to 366,995,000, and we're growing. Which school did you go to, my friend? I mean, the second quarter, Mr. Speaker, we see here that the numbers went from 211,000, 153,000, and then it slumped in 2016 to 179,941. So what we actually did inherit, Mr. Speaker, was an absolute crisis in the tourism sector. It was declining vividly. When we said so in the election campaign, right, I was called short. They said I weighed 72 pounds and I was 5 inches tall. That is true. It was said by the member for Canaries East. And we were telling them that the industry is in crisis and that the Caribbean was underperforming. The region had its most glorious year. And in 2016, it grew by 7%. And St. Lucia only managed to grow by 2%. And here you're coming to tell me that I inherited success? Are you kidding me? I take my job very seriously, you know. So Mr. Speaker, there's a difference from when your sweat is in the game, from someone who receives a brief. Mr. Speaker, I am a hotelier. I am a tourism man, okay? And I believe in the fortunes of this industry, and I believe in what it can do. This is not somebody briefing me. These are real life stories that I have lived, and these are real life stories that I continue to live. This is not a brief. So, when you guys come to play politics with the people's business, do so when I'm absent, because I, standing behind this podium, will not allow you. The other thing that was said tonight, Mr. Speaker, was that our government is somehow favoring the big guys. It was said very clearly, we're favoring the big guys, and we have no compassion for the small guys. Well, Mr. Speaker, I have in my hand here a document that is well known across the tourism sector. It's called the Tourism Stimulus and Amendment Act of 2016. And it was enacted by the previous St. Lucia Labour Party administration. Mr. Speaker, in amendment of Schedule 1 of the Act, it says here, Mr. Speaker, that it lists a scale tax credit for investors. And Mr. Speaker, it ranges from 500,000. If you're investing 500,000 to 5 million, you get a tax credit of 20%. It means these are the small guys, the people that are opening small bed and breakfast facilities. This is the range where the small St. Lucian businessman will be. But, Mr. Speaker, it is very discriminatory. It favors all the big investors. It says that if you invest 25 to 50 million, Mr. Speaker, you will get not a 20% like the small man, but you will get a 60% tax credit. So, Mr. Speaker, clearly we see they are trying to brainwash the people, and they are doing things that goes contrary to what they're saying. It's like VAT. When they're in opposition, they say VAT is oppressive to the poor. When they get into power, it has become absolutely necessary. It is the panacea for economic development. We have to do our self-control, debt and fiscal management scenario. Mr. Speaker, it is consistent. 1 minute, you get Mr. Tony. The other minute, you get Miss Anne. And then you get Tony. So, Mr. Speaker, you have a government, Mr. Speaker, with a triple personality. You know, they're in opposition, they have a leadership struggle, and then they go into government. So, you know, Mr. Speaker, it's three different personalities that they have. So you can't be doing the same thing. Do something differently from what you're saying, and then try to fool people that you are for the small man. Mr. Speaker, look at what we have done. We've come in, and we've said, and we've implemented, and I want to congratulate my boss, the Prime Minister, who I'm very proud of. Because when we came in, he said, listen, for too long, our people have been left behind. This is a personal conversation. And he said, you know, if we implement village tourism, if we give the young people a chance who want to open bed and breakfast, and I'm telling you the difference, listen to this, the difference between heritage tourism and village tourism. He said, if we give our people a chance who want to open up bed and breakfast facilities, who want to open up sites and attractions, who want to invest in a boat, Mr. Speaker, we have left that open for them. We will put money in the development bank, because financing, as we know, regardless of the sector, has been a challenge for micro enterprises in St. Lucia. And so, Mr. Speaker, this is the single largest transformational policy in tourism that we will implement this year. And I am telling you that it will be done this year, because as long as I'm alive, I will ensure that it happens for the people of St. Lucia. There it is, Mr. Speaker, working for the people of this country. So that's why, Mr. Speaker, I get angry when I hear these guys play games with people's business. I get emotional. Because, Mr. Speaker, the times...
Honorable Member?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
I do not want to keep interjecting, but these guys, they are not in here.
Honorable members, yes, honorable members. I am always going to be so guided by you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the year 2018 continued to produce improved results for the tourism sector, with the U.S. increasing already by 12% year-to-date as of February. Mr. Speaker, overall growth is at 5%, and the UK market, Mr. Speaker, is at 9%. Mr. Speaker, cruise and yacht arrivals for 2018 are also another area of significant growth, with cruise passengers by 70%. And yacht arrivals, Mr. Speaker, has increased by a whopping 30%. Thus, Mr. Speaker, the year began with a favorable level of growth, giving us a greater opportunity to create more jobs, increase revenue for small businesses, and encourage more St. Lucians to participate in the tourism industry. On the investment front, Mr. Speaker, I want to join the Honorable Prime Minister, who eloquently enunciated, Mr. Speaker, and it clearly said that in the next 4 years, we will add an additional 2,000 rooms to the existing room stock of this country. And so, Mr. Speaker, when I hear the suggestion that, there are no investments, and the honourable member is for Castries South, has done the most unpatriotic thing. But it seems like it's a Labour Party thing. He is on record of writing an article in the Miami Herald, Mr. Speaker. And when you get a chance, please give it a read. But it's the most ridiculous and unpatriotic thing I've ever found. All kinds of disparaging thing about the country. And Mr. Speaker, despite all these assaults...
Mr. Speaker, a point of order. Can this be made a document of the House?
Is it
because...
Honourable Member for Anse la Raye is rising on a point of order. Let him...
Yeah. So he's imputing improper motives.
Honourable Member... No. I'm just saying to you that you will have to indicate...
You never know what he's standing on.
Mr. Speaker... Mr. Speaker, the honourable member is imputing improper motives, Mr. Speaker.
Standing on what?
Mr. Speaker, can you make the document a document of the House? Imputing improper motives. Mr. Speaker.
Are you continuing explaining your point of orders, or you? No. Honourable member, you in fact made reference to
Mr. Speaker.
The Herald.
Yes, Mr.
All
Speaker.
I'm saying to you is that you would have to be specific, because you're asking or you're saying that something was written in the Herald without giving us a little more information. If you cannot give more information to direct at least me to that particular article or newspaper, then I will ask that you refrain from it.
Very well. So, Mr. Speaker, on the investment front, these includes a 380-room resort from Sandoz. And Mr. Speaker, it's the launching of their 6-star La Souce product in St. Lucia. And it's a program they started in Grenada, Mr. Speaker, and they're about to launch it in St. Lucia. Mr. Speaker, we will also see a 250-room resort from the Fairmont establishment, and that will be in the Choiseul constituency. Mr. Speaker, 2 brands powered by the Apple Leisure Group, Secrets, 350 rooms, and Zoetry, Mr. Speaker, a brand that is well known in the Latin Caribbean destinations of Dom Rep and Mexico, Mr. Speaker, will also have 350 rooms at Canals Bay in Micoud South. are all projects that should commence this year. When completed, Mr. Speaker, these are projected to add 3,250 new direct and indirect jobs to the local economy. Mr. Speaker, we also see a very, very good and positive outlook for the airlift sector. Mr. Speaker, we continue to be encouraged by developments in the sector, which will have at least 2 exciting agreements and add tremendous capacity to St. Lucia. Mr. Speaker, just recently we welcomed Inter-Caribbean to our island with 3 weekly flights out of Dominica connecting our country to the Southern Caribbean. Mr. Speaker, I would like to also announce that come December, that American Airlines will start a 2nd additional flight out of Miami. Mr. Speaker, this will add 1,120 new seats weekly to our destination, Mr. Speaker, giving the destination a better chance to grow and to compete. Mr. Speaker, a lot was said today about marketing, and it was said by a former Minister of Tourism. And I am on record of saying that his knowledge of tourism also needs evaluation. Mr. Speaker, it was suggested tonight that no new marketing arrangements or anything that is substantial was done by the authority. Mr. Speaker, I want to make it clear that not only have we changed the tagline, "Let her inspire you," Mr. Speaker, we have also increased the number of interviews that we have done on major US networks like Fox and NCB and CNN. Mr. Speaker, we've also increased our visibility on social media by tenfold. Mr. Speaker, in response to the hurricane, we also ran a very successful campaign in our key markets and working with tour operators. And the campaign under the tagline, "No time like now to book St. Lucia," was very successful. Mr. Speaker, we also had the successful hosting of the Rum and Food Festival, which, Mr. Speaker, saw some 24 journalists from the international press coming to cover the event with a gross media impression of about 50 million. It is also interesting to note that we only spent $350,000, Mr. Speaker. This, Mr. Speaker, we were able to accomplish with a reduced expenditure at the Tourist Board. Mr. Speaker, you would see in the estimates that the expenditure for the board will decline by $3 million. And Mr. Speaker, despite this decline in expenditure, we were able to accomplish all of this. All of this would mean nothing, Mr. Speaker, if we do not move with haste to institute programs that would generate increased economic penetration from the tourism sector. For this reason, we are on course to implement the Village Tourism Program this year to allow for greater participation from St. Lucian nationals. 8 villages, Mr. Speaker, and towns will benefit from the program, namely Grosley, Canaries, Anse la Raye, Canaries, Soufrière, Choiseul, Labrie, Micoud, and Dennery. Mr. Speaker, the Department of Tourism will expend upwards of $4 million on the OECS Tourism Competitive Program in an effort to enhance overall destination product offering and raise revenue levels. However, if St. Lucia as a destination is to maximize its fullest potential, the governance of the sector has been cited by this administration as an area of priority. Cabinet has just approved, Mr. Speaker, the adoption of a National Tourism Advisory Council, which is earmarked to transition to the National Tourism Council pending the finalization of the legislative framework. This will bring together at least 17 public sector agencies and private sector bodies to cohesively manage and develop the foundation of our economy, tourism. No longer can we manage the affairs of our lead sector in isolation of the broader development goals of the country. The time has come for us to position tourism with a wide interface with departments like the National Conservation Authority, the St. Lucia Air and Seaports Authority, the Ministry of Agriculture, and the Association of Manufacturers in an effort to strengthen forward and backward linkages, Mr. Speaker, in the same vein of increasing economic potential. Mr. Speaker, the Council will finally allow the left hand to know what the right hand is doing, giving us the best chance to build a robust and economically resilient nation. In addition to a total of 43,015,927, which have been made available in the estimates for tourism marketing and product development within the tourism sector over the next financial year. This is divided, Mr. Speaker, into 4 main areas of concentration: policy and planning, Mr. Speaker, tourism development services, tourism marketing and promotion, and information and broadcasting, the other pillar upon which my department stands. Mr. Speaker, allocation is also made in this appropriation bill under the Ministry of Tourism, Information and Broadcasting for the government information services to the tune of $1.49 million. We will effect a major overhaul of the national television network programming to generate an improved level of program content, subject areas such as local and Caribbean history, sports and culture, lifestyles, and a greater focus on information relevant for nation building are all poised to receive renewed focus under this new thrust. Permit me, Mr. Speaker, to clarify suggestions by the opposition leader and certain sections of the SLP propaganda machine that our earlier announced intention to reactivate consultation on the draft broadcast bill is an attempt to censor the media. Mr. Speaker, the facts are that the OECS from as far back as 2009 to 2010 sought to regularize the broadcast sector in the sub-region. This was in response to a proliferation of radio and television stations that were emerging during that period at an unprecedented pace. It was felt, Mr. Speaker, that this new phenomenon was amplifying without a set of specific codes that would guide and develop the sector. In the case of St. Lucia, the bill has been worked on by both UWP and SLP administrations and have been discussed with local stakeholders for nearly 10 years. The former executive of the Media Workers Association met with the former Minister of Information and Broadcasting at least once on the said subject matter, as both showed deep interest in improving the local media landscape. Mr. Speaker, large sections of the media and the public continue to be concerned about standards of media activity, whilst the debate rages on about the quality, appropriateness, and timing of media content. The local arts community is also on public record of claiming a disruptive bias to foreign media content by local broadcasters, while local broadcasters, Mr. Speaker, have indicated that cost and demand implications are enormous considerations for them. Resultant to all this is consultation on the establishment of a broadcast authority and regulations that would add more structure for a free but responsible and ethical press. Mr. Speaker, at no time it is our intention to muzzle the press, nor censor nor intimidate the media, as some has unjustifiably suggested. Mr. Speaker, I happen to have been covering a political meeting on the market steps in my capacity as a TV journalist 20 years ago, when one of my close colleagues in the media was labeled a media terrorist. I know all too well, Mr. Speaker, how such attacks on the press can incite ill will against media practitioners from passionate supporters of political parties. Mr. Speaker, our approach to have consultation on this bill, which we have inherited from the files of the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting under the leadership of the previous regime, is a far cry from the ill-fated 361, which was hurriedly passed and subsequently repealed by the previous administration after it came under vehement attacks from the local press. 361, as it was infamously called, referred to an insertion of Section 361 of the Criminal Code that meant that local journalists, Mr. Speaker, were, if deemed to be spreading misleading information, would be eligible for imprisonment to a sentence not exceeding 2 years. Anyone, including journalists, says anyone. So, Mr. Speaker, we see here that this didn't just have implications for media practitioners, but it also had implications for anyone, because it says anyone, including journalists, found guilty of spreading information that he or she knows is false and is likely to cause injury to the public interest. This is not what we are about, Mr. Speaker. What we are about, Mr. Speaker, is attempting to address a national problem which has been chronic in St. Lucia. And so, Mr. Speaker, we are trying to improve the space, Mr. Speaker, so that we give consideration to potentially offensive language to vulnerable groups like children, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, while freedom of the press and freedom of expression gives all of us the right to speak, it also does not give us the right, Mr. Speaker, to violate another person's rights. Mr. Speaker, it is interesting to know that two of the world's leading supporters of democracy and free speech and expression, the United Kingdom and the United States, have well-established broadcast commissions to protect consumers of media, especially vulnerable groups like children, from offensive media content on the public airwaves. In the case of the United Kingdom, it is the Office of Communications, and in the case of the United States, it is the Federal Communications Commissions that regulate the media. Mr. Speaker, regulation does not mean that you're about to punish the press. Regulation means, Mr. Speaker, that finally we can have an opportunity to set policy and discuss opportunities that exist for us to enhance local programming. Mr. Speaker, large sections of the St. Lucia community continue to be concerned about very little investment in local programming. Mr. Speaker, I ask the question tonight, where are the documentaries and the information on some of our iconic figures and heroes that have gone afield and made us proud? People like Walcott, people like Arthur Lewis. Mr. Speaker, if the opposition is serious about raising media standards in this country and giving the media sector its rightful place as one of the pillars upon which the development of our country can stand, Mr. Speaker, then they will join us in this initiative. And they, Mr. Speaker, will represent the facts rightfully and truthfully. It is important, Mr. Speaker, to make it abundantly clear that this administration had no input into the current bill that we found in the files. We have added nor subtracted a single line nor a single word. It is time, Mr. Speaker, to reactivate the discussion on the way forward for our media space.
Honourable Member, you have 15 minutes
for our country's development to make an informed judgment on whether the various parties have reached consensus on the range of issues. Let us not be afraid to explore ways of how we can advance our country. The media is how a society talks to itself. Mr. Speaker, let's examine how we can improve our media landscape. Together, let us sit down and discuss the merits and demerits of this proposed bill. Let us be true Democrats and not shirk from our individual responsibility to raise the bar. For the media is too important for any democratic civilization to mature. Mr. Speaker, I want to take the remaining moments of my presentation to focus on some of the areas in this appropriation bill and the benefits that it will derive for my constituency. And Mr. Speaker, first of all, I would like to comment a bit on item number 41 under the head of the development of agriculture, where a total of 26,826,892 in capital projects is being proposed to be spent on the sector nationally. Mr. Speaker, naturally, being from an agricultural constituency, I give my unwavering support to this allocation, as it will no doubt improve the lives of farmers in communities like Roseau, Millet, and Munda. Agriculture revitalization programs, Mr. Speaker, will assist local farmers to better fertilize and to manage pests in their respective fields, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Minister of Agriculture and his department for the overwhelming support that they have given the farmers in subsidies. And I want to thank this administration for having the policy foresight to see that the agriculture sector needed that impetus and that boost. Mr. Speaker, to continue building resilience in the local farming sector, I look forward to working with the Ministry of Agriculture to enhance some of our main feeder roads in the constituency. Mr. Speaker, some of the priority feeder roads in which the discussion continues to be held with the Department of Agriculture includes the Kaipak Road in Techime, the Sarak Causeway Road, Mr. Speaker, the Inner Munda Farm Road, and the feeder road from the Delagua to Roseau Highway. At this time, Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank the Minister of Agriculture for desilting already our main drains on various farms in Roseau, and I want to thank you, Mr. Minister. Mr. Speaker, item number 43 under the head Department of Infrastructure proposes to spend a capital allotment of 51,226,699, which seeks to improve our roadways, Mr. Speaker, island-wide, giving our citizens much needed relief in some of the areas. Mr. Speaker, at this juncture, I would like to say thanks to the Department of Infrastructure for the Roseau to Varna rehabilitation road project. Mr. Speaker, what a beautiful picture on the screen. And this shows, Mr. Speaker, that recent initiatives by our government to implement the gas tax is actually bearing tremendous fruit. Mr. Speaker, this is the first time since the building of the John Compton Dam that this road has received this level of attention. Mr. Speaker, the community of Munda, where it passes through, is usually a forgotten community. And Mr. Speaker, this road sends a clear signal to the people of Munda and to the people of Millet and to the people of Varna that we are serious about their development and we're serious about the development of this constituency. And so thanks to the Minister of Infrastructure. I want to also thank him in advance for looking at roads in St. Lawrence, and looking at roads in Masque, and looking at roads from Vanna to Techime. And I want to thank the Minister for a very positive response to those undertakings, so that we can look at strategically evaluating and upgrading the road infrastructure throughout the constituency. Mr. Speaker, please allow me, Mr. Speaker, to thank the Minister and his team for improvements to the Vanna, Techime, St. Lawrence, Masque, and Ottawa roads as well. Mr. Speaker, I want to also highlight item number 47, Head Department Planning, where a capital budget of $13,915,601 was allocated. Mr. Speaker, under this department, I want to thank the Minister for his kindness in kindly agreeing, Mr. Speaker, to acquire lands for the people of Anse la Raye so that they can build a basketball court, Mr. Speaker. This is a constituency, Mr. Speaker, the region of Canaries, that have voted the St. Lucia Labour Party for many, many years. And contrary to what they say, that we discriminate and we victimize, Mr. Speaker, we didn't do that. What we did is we came in and we said that these young people are playing sports, not on a primary roadway, but they were playing sports on the West Coast Highway. God forbid, Mr. Speaker, that something did not happen to the young people of Anse la Raye who were playing football on the roads, the highways and the byways. And so, Mr. Speaker, I am happy to announce tonight that the Ministry of Planning has agreed to acquire lands, 1 acre of land in the location, that we will be putting a multi-purpose court for the development of sport for the first time in history for the people of Anse la Raye. Mr. Speaker, I would also like to comment on the allocation made under the head of Equity, Social Justice, Empowerment and Human Services, a capital budget, Mr. Speaker, of $12,936,384. Mr. Speaker, I want to comment on this allocation. For as many programs enlisted in this amount will engender a sense of renewal and hope and transformation in our people. Mr. Speaker, I would like the people of Roseau to know that the Minister has already approved much needed expenditure to improve the public sanitation facility, which has been partly out of commission. Congratulations to the people of Roseau for their successful completion of the public laundry facility with the assistance of the St. Lucia Social Development Fund, or the SSDF. And so, Mr. Minister, this is a work in progress, but I'm just letting you in advance, I'll be knocking on your door very soon. Mr. Speaker, the entire country will benefit from the policy direction set forth by this administration. In the next financial year, under item 56, under head Ministry of Economic Development, we have some $71,805,909 allocated. Mr. Speaker, 19,000 have been allocated for the Constituency Development Program, which has made sufficient headway in the development and building a number of infrastructural programs in the constituency of Anse la Raye and Canaries. Mr. Speaker, some of these projects would include 2 major concrete roads in Ottawa, Anse la Raye. Mr. Speaker, 1 concrete road built in Masque, Anse la Raye, Mr. Speaker, where the residents there were replacing vehicular parts on a regular basis. Mr. Speaker, there's another concrete road built in the Blackstone, Jackmill area. There's one in Montciso area. There's also another concrete road in Munda, and also another concrete road built in the Upper Vanna area by the Daria family. Mr. Speaker, as this financial year is about to commence, Mr. Speaker, some $26 million is also made under this program for the implementation of the DVRP, or the Disaster Vulnerability Program. Projects from this initiative will also benefit my constituency tremendously, as this administration
Honorable Member, you have 5 minutes left.
Seeks to address very important issues of slope destabilization, flooding areas with drainage, and other resilient infrastructure projects needed. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to say that I am very, very supportive of this bill, and contrary to what is being said and spewed by the opposition, claims of victimization, claims, Mr. Speaker, that we are uncaring, and claims that we are visionless, Mr. Speaker, I have to debunk them. And I want to say, Mr. Speaker, that while we have not arrived to the ultimate destination of building a new and advanced and 21st century St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker, I want to make it absolutely clear that we are well in our way. Employment is up, Mr. Speaker. The economy is growing, Mr. Speaker. And the debt is being managed. Mr. Speaker, we are committed to working for the people of St. Lucia. And we will do everything, Mr. Speaker, that we have to ensure that cheap politics will not prevail. Mr. Speaker, the other thing is, I want to support, Mr. Speaker, previous announcements in this House that we will investigate every single sign of irregularity that was seen by the previous administration. It is time the nation knows about the Jafali affair. It is time the nation knows why there were 4 Jafali passports. And it is time the nation knows, Mr. Speaker, why was there a description of an account called the minister's account. Mr. Speaker, these are gross violations of good governance, transparency, accountability, this United Workers' Party administration. It is not about a vehicle. It is not about a Range Rover. It is really about accountability. We are not singling out anybody. This is not a political witch hunt. We are also asking the former Prime Minister to break his silence on Grindberg. The silence is deafening in the corridors of this House, and we are committed. We're so committed, Mr. Speaker, that we have changed the act of the Crown Prosecutions Proceedings Act, where, Mr. Speaker, we are saying that the act, a section of that act, will not, as it relates to the financial, as it relates to returning funds, public funds to the government, that is not statute bar, and there is no statute of limitations. And so, Mr. Speaker, I support this bill. I support those investigations. It is time that we get serious about irregularities, Mr. Speaker, and it is time we get serious about transparency and accountability. They are not just a statement or a phrase that you use for an election campaign. We must show commitment to them, and we must ensure, Honorable Member, Mr. Speaker, sorry, we must ensure that we do everything we can to keep our country clean of corruption, because corruption robs our country, Mr. Speaker, of much needed funds to invest in education, to invest in the youth, to invest in our playing fields. And so wherever there are any signs of irregularities, Mr. Speaker, I place myself on the cross. Crucify me if I am ever guilty. But for now, Mr. Speaker, we're investigating those issues, and it has my 100% support. I thank you, and I support this bill.